Enterprise Management 360.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tech Chats. Now in today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Galina Antova, who is the co-founder and Chief Business Development Officer at Claroty. So welcome and thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Max. Appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to our conversation because it's an interesting subject which I haven't been able to explore much of recently. We're going to be discussing how CISOs and security teams can no longer really turn their backs on operational technology and continue to see it as a separate entity to their security strategy. There's got to be a way we can bring it all together in one. But before we get into that angle, I wanted to first get your perspective of an overview of operational technology, cybersecurity, and really how it's perceived in organizations today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about that. So I have been in OT cybersecurity for almost 9 years now. And this is one of the passions of my life because what is not widely understood is that critical infrastructure is operational technology, and basically those networks run the world. They literally run the world's infrastructure. And so every single organization has an operational technology networks. Of course, we're used to thinking of critical infrastructure domains such as manufacturing and oil and gas and electric utilities. But even any company that's got an office space, which, it might be not so many after the pandemic, but any commercial real estate, any building has things like building management systems, HVAC, and that is a type of an operational technology network. So the point that I'm driving at is every single organization has a component of those networks. And because they are so different than IT networks, they have been basically mainly ignored in the last 25 years or so since the IT security landscape was developing. The reason for that is a lot of those devices and the networks that they run on were meant to be isolated. They were meant to basically run production in isolation. Obviously, with many of the digitalization projects and with the need for interconnectivity, a lot of that has changed. Those systems are very unique. They're real-time systems. Obviously, they run physical processes. So even simple things like scanning the network or installing an EDR might be very, very challenging and might actually impact the warranty. So we're dealing with devices that were meant to be out there in the physical world for 25, 35, sometimes even 45 years. And so obviously the legacy nature of those devices and the life cycles they have are very different than IT, where we basically change our laptops and phones every couple of years. And so that has made the difference between IT and operational technology networks so stark. And it's only in recent years that really the board of directors and C-level executives are starting to realize the importance of those networks, mainly because of the impact of a breach, right? So if you've got downtime in a physical process, that is much more costly and impactful than just having something like a mail server down. And so the good news is that budgets are being allocated and those networks are starting to be perceived as part of the organization, not just isolated networks. So that's the good news, but we're just at the beginning of this journey and there's a lot more work to be done.
I was going to say there is a lot of work to be done, and it should be part of the conversation. It is so integral to a lot of organizations, and I'm glad to hear that a lot of organizations are taking that forefront of seeing it for what it is. So in relation to that, we're seeing a big digital transformation across a lot of industries. Everyone is trying to keep up and move it forward. So when it comes to these digital transformation projects, you mentioned how big this one would be. How does that impact the connectivity of those, once isolated systems by themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, so digital transformation is everything from deploying sensors on some of the physical machines that will be able to give you better data analytics to predict, for example, when you have to do things like predictive maintenance, et cetera. So what that means is that we're opening a connectivity between a machine, a physical device that had traditionally been isolated, to either somewhere on the cloud or somewhere within the IT infrastructure, because that data needs to be collected, it needs to be processed. Various other examples, everything from how processes are managed to, again, optimizing those processes. And I want to mention that digital transformation projects in general are beneficial to the bottom line of companies, that they're just definitely, though, that's the future. There's no way of stopping those. And they're a good thing for the organization. Now, the challenge is that because we've got that gap between the cybersecurity posture of IT and OT for over 25 years, it's really challenging for folks to narrow that gap now and to start protecting those OT devices in a way that makes them secure as part of those digital transformation projects. So this is really the challenge that we're dealing with.
Another element I wanted to touch on is we're talking about how this transformation can take place and the elements that are needed, but a lot of that comes down to what you were saying before about that conversation that needs to be had between people. So what is that conversation that the CISOs and the security teams need to be having to really mitigate these issues across the industry and bring OT into the strategy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because at the end of the day, it comes down to the people that are executing, and just like anything else in life. And I think that historically, we've had a challenge with responsibility and ownership, right? So 7-8 years ago, it was not very clear who actually owns the responsibility for OT cybersecurity, depending on the vertical and the company. Sometimes we'll be with the engineering side of the house, sometimes we'll be with IT getting involved. That changed pretty dramatically in the last 3 years or so, I would say, especially after the events of like NotPetya and some of the other more significant events where there was a lot of accidental spillover of those powerful cyber weapons into the OT networks. And so what we've seen in the last few years is that board of directors and C-level executives are definitely allocating that responsibility for the protection of OT networks to the chief information security officer and their security teams. So having one throat to choke, so to speak, has made that, from an organizational perspective, much more aligned. And so the conversations that we're having now are, at the end of the day, we're going after the same objective, which is risk reduction. So both in IT and OT, CISOs are going after risk reduction. Now, the issue is that within the operational technology networks, you will do that, you will implement those risk reduction projects with different technologies in a different way that you would in the IT domain. So it's not that copy paste from best practices and technologies, because again, operational technologies are different. They have different requirements, different uptime and availability requirements, but the principles are the same. So what I've seen successful companies do is they think about the governance of their networks and their security infrastructure as one holistic organism. Whether you want to label it an IT network or an OT network, to the adversary, a network is just a network, right? It's part of your infrastructure. We have to apply the same governance model, and we have to think about what are the same core security controls that we want to apply to OT networks. How do we now expand those core security controls to OT as well? But again, how to do that in a way that is not impacting the specific requirements of those networks, right? So you just got to do it with technologies and processes that are very well suited, that are native to those operational technology networks. But in terms of the outcome, you still want a consolidated view across what does the network look like, how are we monitoring it, what are the alerts that we're getting from those networks, and having one team that is actually looking at the protection of those networks. So if I were to summarize that in one word, it will be basically looking at the company as one organism and not making that distinction between IT and OT anymore.
I think that's a perfect way to look at it. Keep it as simple as possible. Whenever you do anything in cybersecurity, as simple as possible helps to mitigate those risks, as you say. And I like that idea of seeing it as one organism. I think that's something a lot of organizations should take away from this. But Galina, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you very much for coming on this episode of Tech Chat, walking us through all of this. It's been really great to hear your insights on it.
Thank you so much. I love talking about industrial cybersecurity, and I hope that this provides your listeners with a bit of a glance behind that complexity of OT networks, and also all the progress we've made in recent years in protecting them. So thank you very much for that.
Of course, I think there's going to be many more conversations down the road between us, so that'll be good. And thank you everyone who took the time to watch this. We hope you took a lot away from it. There's a lot of great information to be gained from all of this. In the meantime, we'll be back next week with another episode of Tech Chat. You can also follow us on our social channels at EM360 on Twitter and LinkedIn. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. And of course, if you're looking for more great content, head on over to em360tech.com.